So I'm going to ask Robin to introduce Jay, and we're going to hear a little bit about pre-treatment from Jay. Over to you, Robin, to introduce Jay.
Okay. I came across Jay Levy, it must be 5-6 years ago. I'm not even quite sure how far back it was. It seemed like an age. It was almost a chance comment on a LinkedIn discussion. I don't even use LinkedIn much. But it led to a continuing and increasingly rich conversation between Jay and I about the work that he was doing and how that connected with the work that we're developing in the UK. This led eventually to a book that some of you may already have seen, Cross-Cultural Dialogues on Homelessness, from pre-treatment strategies to psychologically informed environments. Ray and John and a couple of other people also have chapters in there. And this was our attempt really to bring together the discourse, particularly around housing first, a lot of the exciting creative stuff being done there, with the similar and parallel developments in the UK. So that is, in brief, the story of how we got to know Jay and started to look at how we work together. At this point, I think that's enough for me in terms of setting the scene. Just to reiterate, as Ray was saying from the beginning, for those who've come in a little late, we have a chat function here, which I'll be monitoring. Ray is going to be handling most of the actual interview bit. I shrink into the background for this a long last, been meaning to for a very long time. So at this stage, I'm going to hand back over to Ray to begin our introduction with Jay.
Yeah. Over to Jay, because some people haven't met you, Jay. So do you want to introduce yourself and do a little introduction to begin with?
Okay. Hey, everybody. It's great to be here during my breakfast time and your lunch. So I've been doing this work for, in excess of 30 years now. Started out in New York City, doing outreach on the streets there and working at places like the Port Authority and Penn Station. From there, made my way to the Boston area, where I did a lot of work within the shelters, doing outreach counseling, basically, with folks. I'm an LICSW or MSW social worker, clinical social worker at heart, graduated from Columbia University. And these days, I'm out in Western Massachusetts, and it was a real gift to actually, in Western Mass, to do outreach by the campsites of people along the riversides and be welcomed into folks' world and to meet people where they're at and kind of help to bridge them over to resources and services. And along these travels, I really began to learn, really through trial and error, kind of what worked well and what didn't work. And through getting a lot of feedback from the people I was working with and a lot of the research I was doing, reading various journal articles and interviewing people in the field, I started to come up with this pre-treatment model. But before I jump into all of that, I just want to say, a special thanks really to, Robin Johnson, who's talked a little bit about, how we first met on LinkedIn. And Robin, part of that story was actually that you were involved with a journal back in the day. And I had a book out called Pretreatment Guide for Homeless Outreach and Housing First. Call it the Yellow Book in the circles of the UK. And that book got reviewed in a journal that Robin was part of. Of course, I didn't really know Robin at the time. And the review was quite good. And that kind of kicked off us talking more and more about pre-treatment and also kind of how it connected with what he was doing and what Dr. Ray Middleton was doing and what John Connolly was doing in regard to some of the work in the UK and PIE. So really, I'm so grateful to all three of you for the way you've connected me to the UK and the world of homelessness, as I like to say, the house of language out in the UK. So, I'm really, really thankful and appreciative of that, and honored to be here and to meet all of you today. What I find is that, and I just want to throw out a couple of central or important questions to think about as we connect today. First of all, the central question of outreach is, how can we help those who are clearly in need, yet communicate no need for help? You know, the folks who are not raising their hands and saying, I have this presenting problem, you know, help me with this. A similar question that connects is, how do we help to develop the pathways to treatment and recovery for the folks that we're meeting and engaging with? And what that also connects to is about melting the pre-contemplative iceberg, if you will, because we meet a lot of people that are in this kind of pre-contemplative stage of change when it comes to, say, issues of addiction, or issues of mental health, or issues of even major medical concerns. So how do we approach people to help them have a better quality of life, because they're hitting a lot of obstacles and barriers in this area, and it's getting in the way of some of their aspirations, some of their goals, even their clear need and want to be housed is sometimes blocked due to these things. And finally, to think about the process of how we unleash the expertise of both the client and the worker. And that could be, by the way, if you're a worker, it could be that you're a street medicine physician, or it could be that you're a psychologist, or a psychiatrist, or a caseworker. There's a certain kind of expertise that follows all of those different types of disciplines that we have to offer. It's an offering that we're making to the people that we're meeting as they welcome us into their world. But we also want to unleash the expertise of the client, of the person that we're meeting. What we say in narrative circles, and you know, pre-treatment is so much comes out of narrative psychology, that kind of stance in the way that we think about the work, learning people's stories, understanding what people value, understanding what people aspire, you know, their aspirations. So it's important, as we say in narrative circles, the client or the people are experts on their own worlds. So for us to take a stance that we're going to tell people how to live or what to do, or in some sense, step on their autonomy due to our expertise, and not really listen to the deeper meaning, to the sensibility of where the person is coming from in terms of their own values and what's important to them. I find that often we get to a point where we're working on a little bit of a different agenda than where the person is actually at. So this whole idea of cross-cultural dialogues on homelessness connects to these kinds of questions in that book that Robin introduced, because it's really about how do we go about crossing cultural divides and taking part in a productive dialogue with the people that we want to help. And pre-treatment, it's all about this process of how we get person-centered, how we connect with people. It's all relationship-centered based work that focuses on getting to the point of making goals that are meaningful to the person that we're working with, that resonates in their world. And often that means starting on things that's a little bit different than perhaps our own agenda coming in, and perhaps being surprised by where it all goes. Because when we're getting off of our agenda, we're going into this kind of no man's land. It's sort of a co-production that starts to take place through the relationship of ourselves with the client. And so we don't really know in advance what roads we're going to go down. It's a bit of a journey. It's a bit of a journey. And it's connecting to meaning through that journey and getting goal centered. So now cross-cultural dialogues was a lot about that, but it was really sharing approaches in the UK and approaches in the US. And we came out with certain hybrids out of that. We talked a lot about this idea of thinking about where the intersections were with things like PI and trauma-informed care and pretreatment. And we also talked about in our communications with the people we met to get to that point of meaningful communication, approaches like open dialogue, approaches like common language construction, which comes out of pretreatment, and approaches like appreciative inquiry, which Susan Quinney was also one of the authors in the book, Cross-Cultural Dialogues. And she really brought forth this whole appreciative inquiry approach. So it was an interesting book because I think it really got at ways to communicate and connect with people and brought together the language base of two different countries on homelessness and really worked together on that kind of cross-fertilization on how we can help and do better practice with the people we want to help. Now, the book I want to talk about today is Pretreatment in Action. I'm really excited that this is out. And I thought what made sense is I would start with just a short reading, very introductory really, on from chapter 3, and it's entitled Common Language Construction, Entering the House of Language. A pretreatment approach focuses on getting person-centered with potential clients who, for a number of reasons, inclusive of significant trauma history, difficulty trusting others, denial of significant clinical issues, and the inflexibility of treatment-biased services, we'll talk more about that, I'm sure, are among the most disaffiliated from our healthcare network. It is very easy to deem people who are pre-contemplative in regard to accepting clinically defined diagnoses or formalized treatment protocols as not ready to participate in our services, thereby relieving ourselves of any obligation. However, when it comes to outreach counseling and street medicine, this is the challenge to care. As an outreach counselor, supervisor, and program manager, I have witnessed on countless occasions how all this can change once we establish a trusting relationship that clearly respects a person's autonomy, as well as positive communication based on mutually accepted words, ideas, and values to guide our working relationship. Ultimately, the goals, even if initially thought of as clinical in nature, need to be defined through the client's language. I'm fond of saying that engagement sets the foundation of our work, while utilizing a common language is our main tool for getting it done. Both are necessary to achieve a goal-driven, person-centered relationship. Our objective is to enter the same house of language as the client, or at least to be invited to play on the mutual playground of language that is located between the worker and client's houses. Everything begins with the worker listening for the words, ideas, and values of the client, and then reflecting back what is heard to make sure we are developing a keen sense of what is being communicated. The following exercises, excerpts, and questions for the reader bring to life the challenges of the pre-treatment principle of common language construction and its critical importance in upholding the sanctity of the helping relationship. So I'll stop there, but what you can see by that last paragraph is the book is full of exercises, full of narrative excerpts and questions that follow, and reflective passages on what works and what doesn't work in what we do with clients. And it's really based on this idea of 5 principles of care, that pretreatment provides and learning to do an assessment based on those 5 principles to get person-centered in our work.
Thank you, Jay. I'm just hearing a little bit of reverb. I think it's settled down now. That's great that you managed to read some from the workbook, and it's very interactive where the workbook's asking people to reflect. I'm just wondering, Jay, that you cover a lot of skills about building motivation in the workbook as part of it, but just as what inspired you, what motivated you, Jay, to actually write this workbook?
Well, actually, it's an interesting story. After the book Cross-Cultural Dialogues on Homelessness came out, I found myself in London and at a cafe drinking tea with my wife, Louise Levy, who, by the way, is a great inspiration to my work and really the first editor for everything we do. We go on these long walks and have these great conversations about, homelessness and what I'm trying to write. And of course, I'm there for her. She's a teacher, so I get to hear her stories about education. So I was at this cafe with Louise, and John Connolly was there with us. And the 3 of us were sitting down for some tea. And John was very excited about the book we had just done. And he wrote a great chapter in that book on pretreatment therapy, which they were doing out in London. And John said, Jay, pretreatment, it feels like it's really, taking off. People are excited about it. And John had introduced me to certain people that he worked with who seemed very interested in pretreatment and how to apply it to the work. And he's saying, what we need, though, is a real hands-on workbook. And I kind of looked at him and sort of deadpanned, well, you write it. Because, I was at a point of just feeling, I don't know, very satisfied about the work that had come out, but also very tired and needing a break from writing. So we had that conversation, and that was there in the back of my mind. And I'd say about 9 months later, I was at an international Street Medicine Institute conference. And at the conference, I bumped into Joel Hunt. Now, Joel is a street medicine guru. He's kind of the head of, he is the head of street medicine teams out in Fort Worth, Texas, and also a teacher. And so he constantly is training new people to join the street medicine team. And he was talking to me about how much he really loved pretreatment and was integrating that into their training, but really wished that they had a workbook, that they had like a training manual to help with that. So he loved the stories and he loved the other books, but thought it would be so handy. And then, of course, I thought of John, I thought of Joel, and I was like, okay, I got to pull this project together. So that kind of inspired me. And then as a result, I had asked Joel to actually write the foreword to the book. And I asked John to do the introduction. And they were both so giving and wonderful about it. And that's how the project sort of came to be.
And that's really helpful, Jay, because it shows you that there's a dialogue going on and you're responding to a need that's out there for a very practical kind of workbook. And that could help staff skills development. And so it's a dynamic, ongoing process. That's what I get from that, where you're responding to what people are saying, well, we could do with a workbook around this for people to actually, how do you apply these things? In a couple of minutes, it'd be good, I think, just to hear from John about why he's so enthusiastic about it in the UK. But before we do that, not everybody knows what those 5 principles of pretreatment are. So it'd be good if you could just tell us what those 5 principles of pretreatment are, Jay, because that would help people think about what questions to ask you in a follow-up. So if you could do that, Jay, before we ask John.
Yeah, I'll give the 5-minute presentation on that. It's really, each principle could be, let's say an hour that we talk about each.
Yeah.
But the first principle is relationship formation. And it's based on the stages of engagement. And I break down the stages of engagement into pre-engagement, where you're just trying to get an initial communication with someone, to ongoing engagement, which means you're getting to the point of defining roles and tuning into the person's wants and needs. And then the third stage, and that's an ongoing welcomed communication, conversation that's going on with the person. And then the third stage of engagement is contracting, where you're trying to get goal-centered and they're actually welcoming the services you have to offer. And at that point, there's much more of a language base in terms of we've already tuned in to that person's wants, needs, and the goals that they define is defined in a common language, a language that really resonates in that person's world, so they can take ownership over those goals. And that's the second principle, which is common language construction. And I was reading a little bit from the book, just the introduction to that. But that's really about taking that narrative approach and tuning into people's stories, their words, their ideas, their values, and finding ways to connect with someone where we're not triggering them, where they kind of close down. Maybe they have a trauma type response where either we're getting into power struggles, so there's like a fight response, or they close down because they don't like some of the terminology and some of the words that are being used or some of the concepts that we're talking about. So it's really staying on that person's agenda and on their playground of language and using their language to frame the concepts that we want to introduce, and that could be our own expertise, but really thinking a lot about how we bring that to the forefront in a dialogue with the person that's in line with the meaning that they find in their world. Like a simple example would be, and there's so many examples of this that can be much more complex, but I was working with a gentleman who would be considered an elder, and there's all sorts of services as an elder that you can qualify for, but he didn't like the term elder. So when I used it, that was triggering. So I needed to kind of relook at how to introduce that term and the set of services attached to it in a way that could resonate in his world, instead of something that was closing him down, getting in the way of the engagement process. But there's so many ways to talk about this, and examples in the book, all sorts of illustrations on that. The third principle is ecological considerations, and that can mean a lot of things, but really what we're talking about is supporting the process of transition and adaptation, whether it's to a new idea, to a new environment, to treatment and recovery services, to housing. It's how do we, let's really think about this idea of transitions and be very aware that this is going on all around us all the time. And so the person is transitioning to us in our presence, and they're transitioning to the language that we're using. And we're using language bridges, by the way, we call it bridging language, to help support transitions. Because when I think of the world that we work in, I think of this idea of houses of language. And so there's a house of language of, say, the mental health clinic, or the house of language of the medical world, or the house of language of AA. And then there's the house of language of the client. So the question is, how do we build a bridge that in the end, as outreach workers, we're both interpreters and bridge builders? And how we build that bridge, how we support the person to enter that new house of language is really critical in helping people to get the services and the resources they need. The fourth principle is promoting safety. And when I think about that, there's two kind of pillars to it. One is crisis intervention and this idea of crisis opportunity, and that as workers, we should embrace crisis, and we should use it as the opportunity to introduce these roads to treatment and recovery type services. The other part is harm reduction work, really getting where the person is at. It's a very different stance than crisis intervention, which is a little bit more directed, and perhaps feeding dependency a little more in some ways. But our stance for harm reduction is really about giving something to the client concretely that's going to help them to be safer in a given moment. And at the same time, we're using that, whether it's, let's say, a needle exchange program. There's lots of examples. It could be on a cold night, giving a blanket and a tent to someone. But it could also be, a needle exchange. Either way, there's kind of a need item that you're giving to the person that's going to help them to feel safer in the moment. But at the same time, it's working on the engagement. And it's also working on alternatives as that engagement goes to the situation they're in, so they can begin to imagine other possibilities, other options besides the situation that they're in. And then finally, the fifth principle, and a lot of the work that I talk about kind of builds to this fifth principle in a way, is facilitating change. And the good work that's been done, that probably most people on the call know about in regard to change model work and motivational interviewing. And I like to break that down into a few different areas, but we apply that broadly. So we can look at change model in regard to a person generating income or a person's interest in being housed. But then, of course, we could look at it in regard to the trimorbid issues of, addiction, mental illness, and medical concerns. And it's always starting, where, it's nice to do everything simultaneously, as they say, but you got to start where the person's at. And off of that, we can kind of build our language base and communication to hopefully get at a number of issues. So often we're beginning with housing and income before we're getting to this other kind of agenda that many of us carry in wanting to help people to address clinical concerns. So that's, I think, a pretty quick wrap on that.
That's a really good summary, Jay. Well done. In terms of, very brief summary, which is going to allow us more time. So I'm hoping if people think about the questions you might have for Jay, it's getting where you're at, isn't it? If you ask Jay some questions about what comes to your mind when you listen to this. But before we take questions, I think it would be really good to ask John, just why are you so interested in this pre-treatment approach? What inspires you about it, John? And then we'll open it up for an open dialogue about questions and answers to Jay.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Yeah, thanks, Ray. Because my trainings in psychology and psychoanalysis made me experience working in the mainstream psychological services, mental health services, and also maybe in the private sector. And my experience of psychology was that it's very problem solving orientated. So it's about finding solutions, and it's very blind to process and to human subjectivity and how information is actually experienced. Whereas psychoanalysis is the opposite. It's non-directive at all. So here I was stuck between a very directive way of working and a very non-directive way of working. And I was confronted in my present role with people, as Jay so nicely said, who were suffering terribly. There's terrible suffering. Outrageous.
Can you just say what your present role is for people's benefit, John?
Oh, yeah, okay. So I lead a small counselling service in Westminster for homeless people. And I was shocked when I first took this up because people did not want help or did not trust the help on offer, something I've called a history of toxic help, that they've approached mainstream services in the past and been humiliated or been made to feel misunderstood, even worse. All of these issues Jay goes into, which is why for me, it was such a revelation. I thought, wow, here is something based on reflective experience. This man's been out there, he's met all of the challenges me and my team are meeting, and he's reflected about it, and here's something very practical. And so I restructured the service. We have drop-ins, we have groups, we have individuals, we have appointment-based, and it all follows the stages of change, that we follow somebody when they're ready to engage in a more structured format. Then they can engage with appointments, which is a massive change in someone's outlook. Then also I became very aware of a difference between symptom management, which psychologists are great at, as you know, how to reduce anxiety, how to manage all sorts of distress, versus recovery. Because homelessness, to me, is the juncture of a psychosocial economic set of forces. And the human reaction to difficulty and challenge is anxiety, is trauma, is psychological suffering. But recovery isn't just learning about how to manage our natural reactions to something that's terribly frightening for us, like where are we going to sleep? What's our future presenting us with? Are we going to be attacked tonight or raped or whatever? Of course, we're going to be anxious. So symptoms are context specific. And what I loved about pre-treatment was that it wasn't symptom focused. It was context focused. It was meaning focused. And it was journey focused. It recognized that people's subjectivity is highly dependent on context, is highly dependent on the meaning they make of their situations, and is highly dependent on the support they have. And for me, pre-treatment addressed all of these fundamental issues, which of course the mainstream can't, because it's dealing with people who are housed, whose trauma reaction is constantly triggered. And that's why I'm so passionate about pre-treatment. I really see it as a way forward.
That's great, John. And that really kind of brings it to life for me about, applying that you can apply these principles into your local context, in your case, a homeless service in London, and then work out what difference is that going to make, and what difference will it make to the people we're reaching out and trying to journey with for a little while and try to be helpful. So thank you, John. That kind of makes it come alive in the UK context. So it's time to open up to you, everyone else here, to ask some questions. Do pop your hand up. That would help us, either electronically or we also do the old school physical hand if you want to stick that up. And I will do my best. But it'd be good to be brave and ask Jay a few questions, and then we can kind of make the most of the time we have with him in his early hours in the USA. So who would, and John's, Robin's going to keep an eye on questions coming through the chat. Robin, did you want to say something, to ask a question to start with?
Yes, I'm monitoring the questions as they come in, so please, people, just do post your questions there, or just stick up your hand if you have a question to ask. But since no one has at the moment, I just wanted to pick up on something, Jay, that you mentioned. You slipped in early on in what you were saying about working with people's and recognizing people's values. I know from a lot of your other work that we've talked about recognizing people's concerns, meaning what they want, and not just what their eligibility criteria says that they qualify for, and looking through construction of language about the language we use to engage and form those relationships, and obviously all the trauma-informed stuff about triggers. But I haven't heard you talking before about identifying people's values, but that instantly struck me as being really powerful stuff. So could you say a little bit more perhaps about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, what I find is the people we work with often, in fact, most of the time, really value, first of all, their autonomy. So the folks that we tend to meet that are unsheltered, that are sleeping rough, they've lost so much in their lives. And one of the things they're hanging on to is that very strong sense of autonomy, of freedom. And so instead of looking at it as, well, here we have a person who maybe is non-compliant and not ready, what we actually have is a person that's valuing something. You know, there's a positive side to that. And so I think it's important to connect in that different kind of way. You know, you could meet some people from a narrative perspective that maybe we would identify as having a drug problem, or let's say an alcohol problem, for instance. And they're hanging out in group and drinking together. And you might say, okay, there's a bunch of folks that are drinking too much. But if you connect into the values of what's going on, there's another side of it. There's a side where it's people also watching each other's back, taking care of each other, sharing their drink when their partner needs to have a drink. So there's a value of safety and a value of connection. There's a kind of community that's formed that we need to realize. And so it's not a matter of just, you know, taking away the drink, right? Because with that, you might be losing these other things. So the question is, how do you do the work where the person is not left in a situation where they absolutely don't know what to do, how to live, you know, how to be safe? And how do we do it in a way where if they go back to drinking, they're not actually putting their life at risk or back to using a drug because we've actually detoxed them and they weren't really ready to take that step? That's when there's high risk sometimes of people actually dying, ODing, you know, because they've detoxed, but there's nothing to really replace yet the very things that they valued and found meaning in the sense of community, and they end up going back to using at the levels that they were using previously, which at this point, you know, in terms of their tolerance, you know, that's all changed, and so they can OD. So anyways, there's lots of ways to get into what people value. You really have to listen for it. But people are saying it over and over again. I mean, I worked with a guy that was, I was meeting with, one of the examples I give, who was, he would say, I've been mentally murdered, you know, very colorful way of talking about his trauma. And he was a Black gentleman who was also very sensitive to white oppression and this idea that his way of living was really taken away from him due to white society, and that he felt he had been demeaned and he had lost his job and all these other things. But one of the things I noticed, and we talk about this in narrative psychology as a sparkling moment, where instead of talking about all that, in the midst of that, he brought up, look, I'm too busy now. I have to get into my research. Well, that was something he valued. So the question, the follow-up question, instead of getting into all of the anger, all of the things that were upsetting him, if I wanted to engage with him more, the effective route to go was actually to inquire next time about his research and to be in a place where he could actually let his expertise shine in schooling me a little bit about his world. And that was so important because that opened the door in terms of the relationship and the trust. And actually, his research was about, in his mind, time travel. And you know what? It didn't really matter whether it was like, in my world, real research or made sense or didn't make sense. What mattered is that he valued it, and it was an organizing force in his world. And we don't want to take that away. We want to work with that and look at how that connects in actually with the goals of maybe getting housed. Maybe I can help you to get an office to do your research, or a place to sleep that you can use as an office to do your research. And what would help you with your concentration around your research? And how would it be if you could have maybe less anxiety and be in a place that's calming, where you can focus on things that are really important to you? So it opens up these doors, and they're pathways that we would have never thought of going down without cueing into the expertise of the client and what they're all about. So it's really working with the person's world. And that opens up, it's like almost magic, really. I mean, through dialogue, we get to places we would have never thought of through our own kind of, agenda that has blinders on it, really. We're only seeing a little part of the picture if we're coming from a place of our limited assessments based on people having problems and diagnoses and this kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah, you put that really well, Jay. And I liked what you said about values being this organizing force in people's world. And I can find that with my agenda to kind of get things done or pressure to-do lists. It can stop me listening, or it can interfere with my ability to listen to what that person values. The counteraction, the opposite would be if someone has listened to me and recognizes what I value, I feel listened to, and that connection can take place. And so I think your example brought that to life very well. How important values are, and helping staff in a very busy jobs where there's a lot of emotional wear and tear to actually bracket their own kind of pressures that they're on them, maybe from often the organization they work for or whatever, to be able to listen to the values, because it can be a lot more productive, effective work if I get into the world of the person I want to help and connect with some of these values and they resonate with their world. As you said there, helping someone to develop their research, whatever that is going to help. So thank you. That illustrated it well. I just want to make sure we bring Esther in, wants to ask a question. Esther.
It's perhaps more of an appreciation and a statement of how much I value your bringing narrative therapy into this discussion. It's so rarely heard or talked about. I did a foundation course on it some years ago, but never really get the chance to use it. And it's about the story. And I do encourage support workers in groups to read a file. When did you last thoroughly read a client file? It holds the story. And it will bring something together for you to talk about with a client, which is about them and applying it to, as you've said, their world. And you've also mentioned limited assessments, which have been a recurring theme in reflective practice sessions I do, where there's so little information, there is no story. And when I was working with clients who were experiencing problematic substance use, I always found one of the most searching questions to ask was, tell me, what's it like to be you? What's it like in your world? I want to know. That was always, I found incredibly useful. And so just another point here, which is an observation I've made, is this lovely phrase, a place to play, which I believe comes from Winnicott, space between a practitioner and their client, and it's lovely middle muddle where you do get to play and draw things out, and it's just such a, to invite someone into that space is just brilliant. And also that bridging, which is then what do you do with all this in this lovely collaboration with a client. I just so appreciate everything that you've said. I mean, I could listen to you all day. It's just,
thank you.
Such a rich dialogue. You've brought in so many reminders of my work that I value. And just in conclusion, this happened many years ago when I worked, I was running a structured daycare service in Bath. And although this wasn't at my instigation, one of my clients was actually an artist, a very talented artist. and the chief executive suggested that we actually gave him studio space in a new building we had. And it was fantastic to watch him come along. Really amazing. Thank you for that reminder. I'll stop now, but my very great appreciation for what you've said. And I will, I'm going to get the book. I think it will,
Thank you.
I think it will be very helpful for some of the support workers I work with. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you, Esther. And that was a great appreciation of particularly Jay there, Esther's appreciating you bringing narrative in. I have if I could just, I'll come to Kat Goodacre in a moment for your question, but if I could just add on a question or turn Esther's appreciation of a narrative into a question. A lot of the staff I train in the UK are unfamiliar with the idea that we all have a personal narrative. And so I think there is a little bit of work. So I just want to ask Jay, in the US, are people fairly familiar with the idea that you might have a personal narrative, and or is that something that people need, new staff might need a bit of help to understand that we're helping people with their personal narrative? Jay, what do you think about that aspect?
I think there's a kind of what I talked about in the reading I did. There's a little bit of a treatment bias and kind of bias toward problem-centered work and working with the people that are raising their hands and ready to kind of roll up their sleeves and say, this is my problem, help me. Do the assessment, doctor. You're the expert. Tell me through your assessment what the diagnosis is and what's the treatment protocol. So you have that kind of, I call it a bias. Obviously it helps certain people, that are on that pathway and raising their hands and want that expertise. And by the way, when I talk about this idea of assessment, I'm not really casting it aside in the sense that we shouldn't do it or that it's not valuable. I'm just saying that there's a time and a place for it, and to be aware how it impacts our thinking and how it often gets us away from the personal narrative. It often takes us away from seeing the whole picture and really all the roads that are there that we could be utilizing to help someone to move toward recovery, to move toward a better life. And there are often roads that are much different than what we would have imagined, through our assessments, which I think is just limiting. But there's a time and a place for that. The other thing I would say, where I do see this idea of personal narrative coming more to light, is in something that was just touched on by I think it was Esther who was bringing this stuff up, is of creative expression therapies. That kind of work that people do, that it's actually very engaging with people. I see a lot of that being done in the field with young adults who might be homeless. There might be more of a leaning toward like a poetry group or a hip hop kind of, scene, and taking advantage of that, tapping into that in terms of people writing rhyme and putting beats together and drum circles and things of that nature. And that naturally flows into some of the narrative work. So I do see some of that happening, particularly with the work with young adults.
That's really interesting, Jay, connecting some of the kind of approaches that people might be able to tap into or bridge into, but also getting some of those creative kind of art therapy type approaches to people who are without a home, and how that might help them tap into naturally improving their personal narrative. Super helpful, bouncing lots of ideas around for people to think about.
The other thing I'll add, and I think this new book provides some guidance with this, is there's really a lot that we can be doing in supervision, what I like to call co-vision. And it's very much along the same line. So we could talk about the narrative of the client. There's also the narrative of the worker. And the question is, how does that connect to the work that's being done? And how do we unleash really the expertise that the worker might have through their own narrative? On some level, there's this idea that I've been playing with, and I'm sure many other people have been thinking about this, and that is that we're all peers in terms of the work we do. There's the peer movement. That's one thing, person who has been through a very specific, like I've been through homelessness too, kind of peer movement in working with someone, and I'm an expert from experience. But there's also this greater peer movement really that needs to take place, and that is connecting to our own narratives, our own challenges, how we've overcome difficulties, our own issues of trauma, loss, of course, being very emotionally centered. But the more we kind of know and appreciate our own stories and can connect that into the work that we do, the more personal the work's going to be, and the more that connection is going to have a greater authenticity to it. And we're going to find that people are going to be more responsive than if it feels too cold. That's one of the issues when I talk about language. You know, like the word treatment is a very kind of cold sounding word. You know, I'm going to give you treatment, or I want to help you connect to treatment. Recovery is probably a little warmer, but it's really finding the right words and language that resonates with the person, has a certain warmth to it, and can be defined within that person's world. But coming from an authentic place, that kind of stance can bring you far in the work.
Definitely, and I think the average general kind of work in services is quite far from that, I'd say. But it's got such powerful potential. If we help co-vision or supervision, group supervision, that type of thing, to focus on that workers have a personal narrative as well as the people they're working with, that would be a release. It would help with motivation. I think it would help with the work, so you're not trying to bolt on some of the work you're doing. And there's if we encourage people to see what their personal story was and their values that are motivating them to work in this very challenging, and in the UK often not very well paid work, but actually it's very interesting. You can learn a lot from the work. But if we could help people to orientate to their personal narrative and their values to make sense of the wear and tear of the work, that would be great. So I think there's a lot of potential for helping services shift in that direction, for staff and supervision to shift in that direction, about staff understanding their own personal narrative as well as the narrative of other people. Super helpful, Jay. I just wanted to bring Kat Goodacre in with your question.
Hi, Jay. Yeah, I thank you for everything that you've said. I found it really inspiring. Just to give a bit of context, so I'm actually an adult literacy teacher within a big homeless service in London. I'm also a PhD researcher looking at the use of PIE for adult literacy learners with experience of homelessness or compound trauma. So I have kind of like multiple interests like this. Then I'm particularly interested in how kind of the pre-treatment kind of concept fits in with learning and how adults might learn, and what you were just saying to do with kind of these creative sort of helping people build their narratives. And it's just so like resonates so much in terms of the work that I do as an adult literacy teacher. I mean, I sort of created you know, quite sort of creative learning environments, which are very much kind of driven by what people want to learn, what matters to them. And that's like, as far as I'm concerned, building those relationships and listening to what people want is so fundamental to helping people to learn when people have perhaps have a particularly negative learner identity. And through kind of building these relationships, we can actually kind of shift that and help people see themselves in a different way. So this is just like me from an adult kind of learning perspective. But I was also, I'm really interested in language as a kind of, as an academic, as a writer, because I mean, I've done some research myself and done with interviews with people, and this will be part of my study, but I'm doing the bit where I'm kind of doing my literature review, and I'm looking at the language that people use to talk about people who are experiencing homelessness. And I'm very kind of, I want it to be very person-centered. And I was just, so I suppose my question is, down the line, when it comes to actually doing more of the sort of interviews and things with people, I want to kind of look at the language and use the language that individuals use. But right now, when you look at academic writing around homelessness, it's really varied in terms of how, Sharisa, I don't know quite what the word is, like sensitive it is to people, you know, like, and it's such a personal thing, you know, like I could describe or, you know, label a group of people because I need to do that in order to explain who I'm talking about, but how people respond to that and the emotive, you know, identify with that is going to be very different. Yeah, it's going to be varied. So I suppose the question is, how have you kind of developed the language that you use when you're writing? Has it kind of come from your kind of years of experiences of talking to people in terms of how they identify, and how do you decide on a particular term, or and does it evolve? So this is quite a broad question, but I was just interested.
Well, you know, I kind of think of it in regard to, there's all these different houses of language that we operate in. And so clearly there is at times, you know, like this academic language, and then there's, you know, a medical language, and there's diagnostic language. These are all useful things. So I think of language as kind of like a functional way of communicating. So it depends who the audience is. That's the language I try to speak and connect to. And a lot of it is a feeling out process, you know, where you're reflecting back words and terms, and you're kind of seeing in the end, you know, well, like I said, what's welcomed on the playground of language and what isn't. And you learn. You have to be really open that it's a learning process. It's not, you're not supposed to know the language in advance. Now, when I do some writing, like these books, I try to put on many hats. So I'll say, okay, if a psychiatrist is reading this, how might they view it? You know, if a person who's homeless, who's experienced homelessness and trauma, maybe someone who's part of, maybe an expert from experience, a peer worker who brings their own slant on things, that's very, very important, and contributes to the work in the field in such an important way. How are they going to view what I just wrote? And you can't necessarily please everybody within it, but I'm trying to search for words that I think can resonate across language bases. And so it's really trying on different hats, reading what you've written and say, well, is there another way to frame it where I can, you know, get a larger audience that can tune in. But then, of course, if you're doing a presentation or something, you can really get specific. And what I like about, you know, there's a lot of work right now on cultural sensitivity, crossing these cultural divides, working with people of color, so on and so forth, right? And the question is, you know, in the work that I do, it's so individualized. So we're naturally doing all of that in the sense. The more you focus in on language, it's kind of a house of language. You think of it that way. In that is the culture of the person. If as long as you realize that person's in charge.
Thank you.
So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I was just, I mean, I think that's kind of what I'm trying to do. So that's really helpful that yeah, it's just reassuring to hear. So thank you.
That's great. I just to give a little chip in for, there's a Russian writer you might come across called Mikhail Bakhtin, who people who know me know I'm always kind of promoting him. But, you know, his thoughts underlie some innovative stuff like open dialogue from Western Lapland. And he's very helpful in this idea about language and understanding in a relatively remote context. So a mental health service that's very dominated by the medical model might be particularly unhelpful for people who have a lot of, who are without a home, but also have some long trauma history, etc. And one of the triggering words to them might be, you know, being labeled as personality disorder or schizophrenia, whatever. And so I think Jay's work does allow the staff on the front line to start to think about this. There might be a lot of unconscious barriers to engaging well with someone, which once staff start to think about, actually, what is the house of language that I'm from? What's this other house? And helpfully then Jay talks about this third house of language, which could be the language of, in Bakhtin's language would be the relatively remote context of the local mental health service or the local addiction service or the local, and so it's understanding and trying to bridge these things together, because there might be something helpful in that mental health service, but we want to maybe work out what it might be very remote in terms of the relatively remote context in which the people are understanding. So it's this playing with language and understanding my language, your language. And then there's a particular word, as Jay has some excellent examples, I think, in his vignettes and case studies that in the workbook, where, as he used the example of mentally murdered, if someone says they're mentally murdered, that can help staff to think, rather than, oh, I think this guy's, you know, X, Y, and Z, think that's really interesting. What does mentally murdered mean? And explore that. And I think that kind of has a richness to it in Jay's approach here, which allows people to be tuned in to the power of language and how we only ever own half a word, and the person we're talking to owns the other half of the word. So we might say something and they understand it in a different way, or they say something and we understand it from our narrative and context. So
yeah, I will say, Ray, that you know, one of the quotes from Bakhtin is, you know, we only own half the word, right? So it's how there's our intent in the meaning of what we're saying, but then the question is, how is it received? You know, how does it resonate? And we don't want to lose that playfulness. I think the idea, that's why I look at it as a playground of language. You know, the idea is to have some fun with it and to be light about it, not to be so like, oh my God, did I use the wrong, you know, be aware if you said something and perhaps it's not going over well, it's not resonating, but just be open, have a certain openness instead of being offended by that or being put off by it ourselves, kind of to be playful and to learn and to question and say, and when a person uses a certain term, to ask them, well, what do they mean by it? And you know, it's a kind of stance that you have to have in the work, I think, for it to do well with it.
And the playfulness is permission giving to not be too anxious. The work itself is anxiety provoking enough. We want to encourage staff to be confident to play with these languages and be curious, etc. John, you wanted to come in. Do pop your hand up if you've got other people you want to ask a question. But John, what do you want to ask?
Yeah, no, picking up on the crucial issue of language. I mean, my understanding of language is that it's actually constitutive of ourselves, and that the way we use language and the kind of language we use makes us feel in a different way. So if we start using jargon, for example, it might make us feel professional, in control. It might affect our body language, that we become more set or rigid in our bodily expressions. But if we use a language of subjectivity and common subjectivity, which is what Jay argues for in all of his work, we ourselves feel much more human, much more open, much more receptive, much more gentle, much more sensitive. So there's something about the impact of language, not just on the person we're communicating with, but on us and our body language and our rhythms and our tones and all of these things. Incredibly subtle, sensitive stuff, which I'm ever so grateful for Jay to bringing our attention to. And of course, stress, trauma knocks people's ability to use language. Trauma's numbing is a disorganization of sequence, of logic. There'll be flashes of memory, but maybe no context of a memory, for example. So language is absolutely crucial. I just wanted to thank you for bringing it up.
Well, and I would just add the relationship that really comes before it or is part of the process that we use language to develop is so critical, because within the safe confines of that relationship, you know, somebody could say a phrase to someone, and if you have a trusting relationship with someone, you can hear that phrase and think of it in a positive way or not be offended by it. And if it's someone else that you feel is coming from a place of authority, maybe you don't know well, you don't trust, it could be the same exact phrase, and you might have a totally different reaction to it. So I think the underpinning of the relationship, the trusting relationship, the connection is so important in this. And the other piece is it's bridging language. And that's something that people often miss. It's not about just talking the language of the person and that's it, you know, connecting into entering their house of language. In other words, there's all these other houses of language that if we can introduce people to, bridge them to over time, there's lots of benefits that people can get by being able to enter these different services and resources. But it's being sensitive to what the challenges is going to be for that person showing up at that door to the resource and service where it's a different culture and a different language being spoken. So how do we do the preparatory work? Well, it begins with that person's language, and then it begins, and then you do a lot of reframing of the services in a way that the person can hear it and begin to really contemplate it. And that's really then going into change model and working on this idea of how do we help to melt that pre-contemplative iceberg? Well, it's through this relationship, it's through the languaging, it's through the reframing, and it's through then having some active dialogues about it. I'm often thinking, how do we help the person to build a mental health vocabulary over time, for instance? And that takes some time and work to do. It's not just accept this vocabulary. You know, you walk into a mental health clinic, that house of language, they might ask you just through their assessment, you know, have you ever been suicidal? Or you're going to see terms like psychotherapist, psychiatry. They'll talk about medication. They're going to talk about your past psychosocial history and ask questions in a certain kind of way. They might talk about diagnoses. So this is the language that's going to come up in that world. So to just send the person over there where they may be triggered left and right by that doesn't make a lot of sense. So how do we help to bridge them over? And part of it is literally within a trusting relationship, helping them to understand that language. And that can go far. You know, sometimes that really opens up a person to saying, you know what, I realize now a little better, you know, where they're coming from. And sometimes it is substituting terms. You know, I have an example in one of the books I've written of the word psychotherapist. And you talk about the word therapist. And if you take that word and you write it on the board and you put a dash between the THE and the rest of the word, you got the rapist. And so imagine like a psychotherapist, like, you know, a psychotic rapist or something. Well, I had a guy that I was working with, that's how he viewed psychotherapy. You know, he would like look at the words and to him what they meant, and he would analyze them. And so when I was first doing a referral and talking about psychotherapy or seeing a therapist, that was not going over very well. So I had to take a step back and to learn. But he liked the idea of counseling. He liked having a counselor. So how we bridge the language with the person, but then also how we work on those welcoming pathways into these other systems of care. That's a whole nother piece of the work, and developing a good working language with all these resources and services and helping them to individualize more and to be sensitive to the terms that are triggering versus that aren't for the particular people that we're referring. So we want to develop these pathways into these various services and resources where the person feels welcomed.
Great. Yeah, we're getting a real flavour of the richness of avenues that are in this workbook, Jay. I'm going to come to Esther in a minute, but I wanted to ask John McGlone to ask a question, and then I'll come to Esther. John.
Yes, hello everyone. We've just been chatting about narrative, and as well as the narrative concerning the individual and the worker, I think we also have to consider the narrative that society follows about homelessness
Mhm.
How would you go about changing that?
Great question.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have an answer to that. I would open that up to the group. That's a great question. It's a big one. I think I'm so focused on the world that which I work with in terms of the systems of care, and working on getting dialogue going with people in regard to the barriers that we face in getting the help to the people we want to help. And I tend to think that helps in terms of within our system of care, homelessness services and some of the greater clinical services that are naturally interfacing with the world of homelessness. Part of, I guess, my writing is to help to contribute to thinking about that greater narrative in a different way. But I have to admit, my writing is not so much on how this larger narrative that we're talking about on homelessness. So I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say on that.
Thank you, Jay. That's a great question. I think John's question raises this idea that there's all sorts of narratives bouncing around, and some of those more powerful ones in society you could call ideologies or discourses. So there are narratives around being homeless or maybe being addicted to drugs, and people fit their identity or their subjectivity into these narratives. So people can get stuck in very negative narratives. I know people I chat to who see themselves as there's no hope for them what they're doing is they're struggling with a sense of identity, often because of past trauma histories, but they're fitting themselves into these narratives. And one of the things we can try and do is offer more hopeful narratives. I think that's the power of role modeling when people have come out of having those types of problems, often multiple combined problems. Role model the fact that I've got a job. Like, my background is that, I'm a granddad now and I've worked for a lot of time, but I've come out of that kind of world of mental health and, having addiction problems in the 90s. And that role model is powerful because people are carrying a narrative to say, actually, you don't need to get stuck in these entrapping narratives, like, whatever they are. So I suppose I just partly responded to Jay's question, throw you back out again. I think it's a great question John brings in. There are all these negative narratives and there are positive narratives and they're all struggling. And it helps staff to become aware of actually what narratives are bouncing around in myself and the person I'm with. And we want to challenge some of those really negative narratives of society that devalue people, or you're only valuable if you've got X, or if you don't have these problems. So
I would say, in the US in particular, the narrative is more one that's based on individualism and really finds fault with the person who's become homeless. So that's a very strong negative narrative that we're constantly challenging. I just had a meeting with the legislative body for Massachusetts, and it was around developing safe havens. And the Safe Havens program is a program that is kind of like transitional housing or shelter, a little bit like your hostel system, homelessness hostel system in the UK. But it's very targeted toward the people who have severe mental health, trimorbidity, as I was talking about earlier, the unsheltered population. And it's a safe space to welcome people in without people having to pay any rent, without people having to raise their hands and say they have an illness or a particular problem or diagnosis, without people having to be sober. So, they don't have to commit to treatment or be in compliance already. It's a housing first type model in that sense. So in my presentation to the legislative group, it was really laying out, what am I seeing on the ground? What am I experiencing as an outreach worker? What is my staff experiencing when they meet these folks? And it's telling people stories, and that helps to break through some of those negative narratives and to say, here we have people with some major, no fault of their own really, major issues living on the streets. And if we just leave them there, they're going to die or end up in jail or be in our hospitals. And is that what we want? Is that what we want as a society? So that challenges that negative narrative. And to be able to have the forum of a legislative body to present that, and for them to come back with money, they just got put $1.5 million just for in the state of Massachusetts to set up 3 of these programs and that was 2 years of advocacy to get that far. But again, it really is to challenge that. You had to understand the narrative of the legislative body to some degree and how they think.
Have a dialogue with them, and you've got to understand the narratives that play.
Their narrative and why they might have some negative narratives and how you can find some effective ways to challenge it. So I'm kind of going about this maybe not directly, but that would be my answer to the question. You know, you find these places of power that can change people's lives, and you have to try to find a way to open up the dialogue. And the challenge is quite the same. It's a whole nother house of language that you're entering, and it's identifying how can you get to the point of productive dialogue.
Yeah, fantastic. Go on.
When you mention individual blame, what we do with Crisis and the Frameworks Institute is we change the narrative that people are using about homelessness. So we try to change how people think, feel and act about homelessness. We shift the narrative to build public and political will to action and to change. So what we try to do is reduce the fatalistic attitude that people have. For example, homelessness has always happened and it's always well. So we shift the blame away from the individual in that society often views it as it's all their fault and it's their situation which is caused by their poor choices. So we explain the systemic causes of homelessness. Could be bereavement, death, unemployment, relationship breakdown, mental and physical health, all of that. And sometimes the press propagate a hero, victim, villain frame where the homeless person is portrayed as the villain. The taxpayer is the victim who's funding the homeless person, and the government is the hero, when often that's not the case. The majority of times it's not the case. We shift the frame so we can portray the government. If they're deserving the frame of the villain, we'll shift it onto them and remove the individuation and the blame from the homeless person to try and reduce the stigma and marginalisation that accompanies it. So we try to explain how systems are made by people, decision makers, politicians, governments, and because they're made by people, they can be changed. And when we were talking about values before, to change that, we use the values of, say, interdependence, moral human rights, stories, metaphor, and explain how people don't choose homelessness as a lifestyle or a career choice. They're pushed and pulled into homelessness. So values we use to show how people are connected, how we all have a shared right to a home. And we use a values narrative around homelessness because first and foremost, they're the most important tool in opening up hearts and minds. So,
John,
yeah,
I'm just saying you put that really well. Like there's such a, you packed loads in that work sounds excellent about connecting some of the stuff Jay was talking about. I'm just conscious that we've only got about 5 minutes left and I want to finish on time. And also give a chance to wrap up, you see. So I'm going to apologise to Esther because you did want to come in, but you came in before, so that's okay. Esther said that's fine. It's just, it'd be good to kind of wrap up rather than falling off a cliff, as it were, at the end of it, to wrap up. Jay, do you want to just come back in and have a few thoughts about wrapping up?
Just one last thought on this, challenging some of the narratives, and then we can wrap up a little bit, is one of the big movements, the Housing First movement, has been, creating a narrative, in the US. It's gone beyond the US, of course. I know you're doing some of it in the UK, but it really has forced us to look at, the benefits housing to everybody, and this idea of connecting into one, the economic benefits in terms of healthcare costs and how through Housing First we can control that. Two, that it can save lives, and as a society, don't we want to do that? And thirdly, this idea of quality of life, that if you're helping people to get off the streets and into housing, it's a way of improving the quality of life, not only of the person first and foremost, right, that's homeless, but the quality of life of the town or the particular city that people are in. So these are some of the things that I see going on in terms of trying to challenge the other ways of thinking of kind of the individuality. Homelessness is not my problem, and these people are causing me a problem. It's a way of saying it's a societal ill, and if we can address it more properly, and due to some of the economic issues, due to the cost of housing, due to other systemic issues. But Housing First is not the whole answer. It's a part of a way to go toward addressing this. And it's an interesting narrative that's formed, very strongly in the US in terms of the way things are talked about as we try to go up to get funding for programs and things.
That's great.
Just to add that.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. And it just connects in a nice way, the opening up a dialogue about your workbook on pre-treatment has kind of connected those values, can be a way to connect to that wider group of people, maybe the decision makers, the politicians, etc. I'm gonna hand back to Robin to kind of wind things up, because this is the PIElink forum. Sorry, I'm gonna mute myself because my dogs are going crazy.
Yeah, the two rules of Zoom conferences, one is don't sit with your back to the light, and two, don't have your dogs in the room, because they will always set everyone else's dogs off barking, as we've found. Okay, just quickly, I would like to remind you that with our next forum, these forums run Tuesdays and Thursdays lunchtimes right through the rest of the month until mid-December. The next one, we're going to be looking at PIEs in youth services, opening up question as to whether or not there's something in particular about youth services. Are there particular insights that we can draw from looking at sectional populations? We'll be doing more of this next year. But for now, it's a delight to have Jay Levy with us for, even if only for a few short moments. Jay, I don't know where we go next with this, but I'm sure there will be a next with this. What else can we say? Thank you very much for coming, Jay. In particular, I'd like to thank Ray. I'd like to thank you for chairing. It was there was a lot of stuff coming in towards the end there, so it's hard to keep it all going, isn't it? And I think that's probably, well, we have 1 minute left if it's 13:58.
I mean, if I could just say my thanks to everybody. It's a real privilege to be here. It really is, and all the more valuable that we're doing this transatlantic conversation. And I really appreciate the relationships and the dialogue that's been able to happen today, and the ongoing relationships I've had with some of the people in the UK, and namely, Robin, John, and Ray. So thanks again for everything you've all done. And introducing me to so much, and I've been learning so much about this issue of homelessness and kind of the transatlantic dialogue that we've been having. It's been really priceless.
Can I just say, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jay, if anybody who wants to get the workbook for their organization on your website, they can get a discount if they put help homeless in. Have I misspoken here, Jay, or is that true?
That's right. Well, they can, if they go to www.jayslevy.com. So jslevy.com. You'll see the instructions is right on the website. Yeah, I think it's help homeless in all caps. But it's, wherever, if you're interested in the book, it's available in all sorts of places. Amazon or Barnes and Noble. I don't know, other. Certainly, I don't know offhand the different UK distributors, but I'm sure they have it.
And we'll cut and paste at the end of the recording of this that we'll then put on the PIElink and send out to everybody. We'll cut and paste a link directly to Jay's site where you will be able to book. And as Ray says, add in help homeless and you get a modest reduction, which you can always give away, of course. Folks, it is now 2 o'clock, and as Ray says, we do try and keep that kind of boundary. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you again, Jay, for coming and talking to us, Ray for chairing so ably. And folks, we'll see you all again, I hope, at future forums.
See you soon. Good to see everybody.